Welcome to Politicus, the only podcast that discusses politics and public service from the Portuguese-American perspective. Here we discuss everything from federal policy, local issues, and U.S.-Portugal relations with the goal of driving more discussion and awareness of the issues affecting our nation, our community, and what we as Portuguese-Americans can do about it. And now, Politicus. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining us for another episode of Politicus. My name is Angela Simoes, and I'm here with Denise Borges. How are you, Denise?
I'm great, and yourself?
I am doing all right. We have a special guest. Well, all the guests are special, right? But why don't you go ahead and introduce our good friend who's our guest today?
Yes, we're very happy to have here State Senator Danielle de Ponte from the great state of Rhode Island. Senator de Ponte, how are you?
Good. How are you?
I'm doing fantastically well. Welcome to our podcast, and thanks for taking the time to chat with us and our listeners and bring us up to par on what is going on in the great state of Rhode Island and also in our Portuguese-American community. And as always, we try to start these podcasts with a brief bio, and who better than yourself to let us know. I know Portuguese-American community throughout the United States of America has heard of Danielle de Ponte. You've been a household name in many areas, not just in Rhode Island, for your work with our communities, not just also in the political realm. But if you would kind of give us a little bit of a short bio on who you are and how you got into this wonderful world of public service. What drove you to become a state senator from Rhode Island, and who knows from here what will be next?
Well, thank you very much for inviting me to participate. I've been a lifelong Rhode Islander. I was born and raised here. My parents are both immigrants from the Azores. My father from the island of San Miguel, my mother from the island of Santa Maria. They met here. My mom was 7 when she emigrated. My dad was 16. I grew up around politics. My dad had volunteered on campaigns, and, we always had a very solid representation of Portuguese Americans representing at different levels the city of East Providence, which is where I live, both on the school committee, the city council, and state representative and state senator. The Senate seat that I represent today has been represented continuously by a luso-american since 1959.
Wow.
So growing up around it, I had a bird's eye view of what those elected officials did on a day-to-day basis because of, some of them being close family friends even. So I certainly had an appreciation for the public service part of it. The politics, even to today, is the part that I think I enjoy the least. A little too dramatic and cynical at times, but I think it's at the end of the day about public service. And so growing up, I always had an interest in eventually someday running for elective office. Not really sure and hadn't really given much thought about to what level. But back in 1998, my immediate predecessor, Paul Tavares, who's also a luso-american, decided to run for general treasurer of the state of Rhode Island, and the seat that he occupied at the time became vacant. And there really wasn't anyone that had immediately popped out from the Portuguese-American community to run. And, having been involved in my church and having grown up here, I got the sense that the community still had a special need to be represented. And so I gave it some thought. I asked some people what they thought about me running for office. I asked my parents. They said, absolutely not. But I was a sophomore at the University of Rhode Island. I was studying business administration. And I thought to myself, I'm going to give it a shot. I mean, the worst that can happen is that I won't get elected, but I'll have had a wonderful experience, met a lot of great people along the way. And if I don't win, I'll just go back to college and do what, every other college kid does, study, have a good time, and drink a little beer. But as it turned out, we had a good organization, a great organization, really, of people that had known me, growing up, but also put a tremendous amount of faith and trust in my ability to actually, hold elective office. And we had a primary election that we won, a 3-way primary, which we won with 54% of the vote, and then went on to win the general election with against an independent with 70% of the vote.
You were 20 at this time, correct?
Yes, I was 20 when I was elected. I made my 21st birthday the first month and a half of holding or serving in my seat. And I graduated. This was was elected in 1998, November of 98, sworn into office in January of 99. I continued at the University of Rhode Island as a student and graduated in May of 2000. And then about 7 months later, ended up starting my career as a financial advisor, which I still do today.
And one thing about your district, your area that you represent in the Rhode Island State Senate, the area of East Providence is an area that has a pretty substantial amount of Portuguese Americans, correct?
Yes, it does. It has a substantial amount of Portuguese Americans and Portuguese Americans that are just totally integrated in every aspect of the community, whether it be as business people, whether it be as bureaucrats in government, whether it be on the police force, on the fire department, teachers, public employees. It's a community that's been here since the 1930s, I guess, and ebbs and flows in generations. But I would say that, East Providence, I believe, is the third or fourth most Portuguese in terms of density, most Portuguese city in America. And it's a very active one.
And so they do participate. That's one of the things that, we always discuss throughout the entire United States of America is political participation of our community. But it seems like in your area, you have no lack of participation, which is great.
They do. I mean, they participate, but, like anything else, primary elections, at least here, I would imagine it's very similar elsewhere. Primary elections are where, most of the action, happens in most cases. And so, I think when I first ran, there was also within the community a certain level of excitement, a certain level of even, I guess, apprehension, probably because I was so young. But folks were energized to, get involved in the campaign, to make sure that they get out to vote. We use a system where we identify voters, and folks volunteers on the campaign are responsible for contacting those voters that they know, their relatives and friends and neighbors on election day. But, as time goes on and as you get elected and, for several terms, I didn't have any opposition, which was very nice, but then had another Democratic primary opponent one time and had a Republican, there does get to be a certain level of, comfort. I don't want to say apathy, from a negative sense, but, that comfort in saying, well, he's been there for a long time, he's well liked and well respected, he'll be fine in terms of reelection. And I think that, that happens, unfortunately. I mean, the famous story of the former Speaker of the House, Tip O'Neill, his longtime neighbor didn't vote for him because he didn't ask. And so, that is something that we continuously need to pay very close attention to.
You believe that, now in almost 20 years, since this 1998, since your first election, and I'm sure politics have changed tremendously in the last 2 decades, but some of the issues that face the Portuguese American community in your area, you just said that the Portuguese American community in East Providence, for the most part, are very well integrated into the mainstream society in general. So do you feel that there are some specific issues to the Portuguese American community in your area? Or are they pretty much in line with what's basically the aspirations and the issues for Americans in general?
It's pretty general, when compared to the community at large or even some of the other ethnic groups. Recently, or within the last couple of years, we've had one issue in particular that's of specific importance to the Portuguese community, and that is back in the 1980s, one of my predecessors actually introduced legislation which was ultimately passed to specifically designate Portuguese as minorities in the state of Rhode Island. And several years ago, there were several under-the-radar attempts, I guess, to change the law that I thought was, in effect, and the community didn't really make a big deal about it because we were able to successfully make sure it didn't go anywhere. But it would have basically taken the Lusophone-speaking Portuguese community, whereas they would have redefined the statute to align or define Brazilians with the Latino and Hispanic community, would define the Cape Verdeans and Angolans and Mozambique with the African American community, and the Portuguese, Azores, Madeiran Portuguese people would have been totally cut out and discriminated against. And fortunately, we were able to prevent that from happening. But it's one of those examples where now, for a long time now, we've had public projects. 10% of the public works projects need to go to minority contractors. Obviously, they have to be qualified. So it's an opportunity for our community to have a little bit of an edge in certain instances for some of these public works projects.
Let me ask you just to clarify that, Senator Ponte. So in Rhode Island, the Portuguese are officially classified as a minority group.
That is correct.
Oh, fantastic. That doesn't happen in many states of the Union.
And what kind of, I'm curious, what kind of, so you mentioned one of the benefits is that, when it's bidding for public works jobs and things like that, what other types of benefits, and people can assume what they are, but let's just be like crystal clear on what that means. So what kind of benefits do the Portuguese get as a result of having that status?
Well, I think it depends on who is recognizing the minority status and to what degree they're recognizing it, whether or not they choose to recognize it at a state level or whether or not they choose to recognize it at a federal level. What are considered minorities. It hasn't come up as an issue that has been challenged, frankly, when we look at university admissions, for example. I'm not sure anyone has made the case or even raised the issue of whether or not admissions were based on state level minority status versus federal minority status.
Right.
And so I can't really speak to where that would, the one that I absolutely am aware of happens to do with public bids and public projects. That is according to state law. With regards to other institutions that might be governed more closely by federal law, it's definitely something that's worth looking further into for sure.
One of the reasons I asked is because, a few years ago, there was the issue of whether or not Portuguese should be considered Hispanic for the purposes of the U.S. Census. And we, conducted a survey and overwhelmed, and there's people on both sides of the fence in the Portuguese community on that issue. And in reading the results and a lot of the comments, most of the people who were against that weren't against it because they didn't want minority status or anything like that. It was purely a cultural thing. Historically, we are not Hispanic according to a lot of people. And so it really wasn't a balk against, we don't want to be considered minorities. It was we want to be classified properly, right? Culturally and ethnically, it's how we want to be classified. So it's an interesting, I had no idea that Rhode Island had this policy. And so it's something that, personally, I think should be considered for other states where there are large Portuguese populations. So
certainly kudos to Rhode Island. And it's interesting that you mentioned also that basically when this movement to take out these other Lusophonic groups away from it, the community was able to come together and unify.
Yeah, like I said, it got my attention certainly, mm-hmm. and it died a quiet death. Mm-hmm. I also, in fairness to my colleague that proposed the legislation, he's a very decent man and someone who I respect. I don't think his intent. I don't think he was intending to discriminate, and so I also didn't want to I didn't want to put him in a predicament that really, frankly, he was not intending to have to deal with. And so we had a very candid and respectful conversation, and he understood where I was coming from for sure. He happens to be an African American, and I told him, I said, hey, if this was the shoe was on the other foot, you, I'm sure, would feel exactly as I do.
Right. One of the other issues that's to talk about briefly in our limited amount of time, but that is I know that you've been heavily involved, as you said, with the Portuguese-American community in Rhode Island and throughout New England. I know you visit also the Azores periodically, whether it be for pleasure or on business, or representing your great state of Rhode Island. One of the issues I'd like to mention is, how do you feel as someone who really knows the community and knows also Portugal quite well? You have constant contacts with Portugal. How do you feel the Portuguese Americans are beginning to, or are we beginning to, kind of have a bigger say-so, let's say, in the relationship between the United States and Portugal, and how you feel that our community can be a voice for Portugal in the United States? You feel that's a possibility, even though we're spread out?
I do. And I think one of the things, and I'll speak to it, starting at a very micro level here locally, I think we need to be, and I would imagine, I'll preface it by saying I would imagine this is applicable in other, Portuguese communities, whether it's in California or New Jersey or, Florida or Massachusetts. I think we just need to be very careful to not become victims of our own success. And I think, the reality of life today is very different than the reality of life when, my parents and grandparents, immigrated. Folks are much busier. And so I think, we need to focus more on quality and not necessarily quantity in terms of the number of organizations that we have. I mean, I'll just give you an example. The city that I live in is the city of, about 50,000 people. I'd say about 20,000 of them are Portuguese, of just Portuguese descent. And we have 7 Holy Ghost organizations. We have a Portuguese athletic club. We have a Portuguese band that's housed at one of the Portuguese churches here. And so as the generations get older and as people get more and more tired, we're going to eventually lose some of that. And we need to be, I think, cognizant of the fact that more is not necessarily better. And also, and I say this all the time, I mean, I speak about my own, family. I've got 2 children, they're 7 and 9. My wife, who's Portuguese and, obviously plugged into the community. If we wanted to do our part to keep the traditions alive at one of our Holy Ghost clubs, and we were to go there, and I always use the example, if we were to go there and peel the potatoes for a matança de porco the following day, and brought our kids, there's really not much or anything, frankly, for them to do there, other than do things to probably get themselves in trouble by, kicking the ball around and breaking a light or something. And so I think we need to start to evolve where there are greater amenities at some of our organizations. And maybe some of our organizations, frankly, need to consolidate and combine forces while they still have assets, while they still have money. I sometimes think about what I would love to see around here would be a Portuguese organization that would have, maybe a daycare where the kids, the children actually learn Portuguese part of the day. There'd be a place where the older folks could go and hang out and maybe do day trips. Have a nice, fine restaurant that, members, but also folks from the community could go to. So I think some of those are some of the things that I think we need to, as a community, start to work towards and not, be so concentrated in our own little organizations that, we end up putting ourselves out of business. I mean, we're, as I said at the beginning of this conversation, the community, I think in general, everywhere we are, is now totally integrated at every level and in every aspect of society. And I think, collectively, as our populations continue to grow with the future generations, I think we can continue to be a louder and louder voice for the causes that we certainly care about and matter.
Well, those are very wise words.
Yeah, I feel like deja vu, some of the conversations that we've had out here.
And very inspirational as well, I think, because that's indeed what is going on through much of the Portuguese-American communities throughout the United States. One other aspect would be this relationship between Portugal and the United States. And I know that you're kind of involved, whether it be through this legislative dialogues that FLAT puts together, that you've attended several times, whether it be your contacts with the regional government of the Azores and also the government of mainland Portugal. How do you see this these transatlantic relationships moving forward as the community integrates, as you said, and has a different foot in the United States, different than our parents or grandparents did?
I think, the lack of boundaries. I mean, the way technology has just opened the world to everyone, frankly. I think, the cultural connections will continue to be maintained through the travel and some of the cultural exchanges, whether it's a folklore group that might go to Portugal for over the summer. But I think the real opportunities are around the academic opportunities. FLAT, I think, has done a wonderful job with their Study in Portugal network. Dr. Michael Baum, especially with the support of the president of FLAT, Vasco Hatz, and the board. I think that's where the real opportunity arises, because from the academic connections will then come potential economic and other professional opportunities. They can incorporate, internships at Portuguese companies, and if there's an opportunity to do the opposite with Portuguese students coming here to the United States, I think that's where the future holds great promise and great opportunity. And from that, other deeper relationships and opportunities can evolve.
So I'd like to maybe, if we could have Senator Ponte ended with, not very many Portuguese Americans were elected at the age of 20. And in one of our missions, as Angela points out in our programs, is to basically not just have these conversations, but also entice other Portuguese Americans to get involved in the political process, whether it be volunteering in a campaign or running for office at the age of 20 is fantastic. So we'd like to end this podcast with maybe a couple of words from on your behalf on how Portuguese Americans can become more involved, and to maybe to our younger listenership, not to be afraid and to go out there as you did at the age of 20. What's some of the words of wisdom and some of the advice that you can give to our community?
Well, my appeal would be to younger people. Certainly run for office. We all know the reality of politics in America, not just in America, but in the world today. It's hard. It's not pleasant. It's not fun most of the time. But with politics comes elective office, which come the levers of power to be able to do things for the community at large, but also to defend the specific needs that our particular community might have. And for some of the older folks that may not want to, run for office, support those younger people and encourage those younger people to run for office. Because politics and is a very, especially today with all of the challenges, it's a very fluid reality. And while we may have, I use the example many times, when I first got elected to the Senate, there were 4 of us in the Senate that were Portuguese Americans, some closer connected to the community than others. Today, I'm the last man standing, so to speak. And that, that can change. With elections every 2 years, we can go from having very strong, robust representation to a situation like we have now, where we only have one person. And so I think it's important for folks to, as hard as it is, as challenging it is, as awful as politics may be sometimes, we all have a responsibility to step up. And if we can't step up ourselves as candidates for office, then to certainly support those that are willing to step up, that are willing to sacrifice, and doing so for the right reasons.
That's
Thank
excellent.
you very much.
Yeah, very inspiring words. I hope that they resonate with our leaders, yes, and our listeners. So we have reached our time, but gosh, we really covered a lot and had a really great discussion here in such a short amount of time. Thank you so much, Senator DePonte. It was really a pleasure talking with you, and we wish you much continued success. We hope you're there for another 20 years, if not more. And, we wish you the best, and thank you for being here. Thank you
very much.
Excellent. And thank you to all of our listeners for joining us for another episode of Politicus. If you have any questions or suggestions, please email us at palcus@palcus.org. And if you haven't hit that subscribe button, please do so now and share this podcast with friends and family. We really need to spread the word out there about getting involved and public service, and as Senator DePonte says, running for office. So with that, we will say adeus, até logo, until next time. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to Politicus, the official podcast of PALITICUS, the Portuguese-American Leadership Council of the United States. PALITICUS is the premier national organization representing the interests of the Portuguese-American community at large. To learn more about PALITICUS and how to become a member or to make a donation, visit www.palcus.org. To submit feedback or suggestions about the podcast, email us at palcus@palcus.org. The views and opinions expressed by the hosts and guests of the show are not endorsed by PALITICUS.